Dachau, Germany, August 15, 1942. The Bavarian sun cast long shadows across Barrack 5 as Dr. Sigmund Rascher, physician of the SS and captain of the Luftwaffe, stood before Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS himself. Behind them, workmen installed the final components of specially constructed tanks, each large enough to hold a grown man submerged in water. Rascher's eyes gleamed with scientific enthusiasm as he gestured toward the equipment. The Battle of the Atlantic had been claiming hundreds of German pilots, he explained. Aviators forced to eject over the frigid North Sea, where hypothermia killed within 60 to 90 minutes. Traditional medical research, experiments on animals, ethical protocols, all of it was too slow, too imprecise for the urgency of total war. Himmler nodded approvingly as Rascher outlined his solution: direct human experimentation using concentration camp prisoners as subjects. These men were resources currently wasted, Rascher argued. Their lives without value as workers but precious as experimental material. Through systematic exposure to extreme cold, through meticulous measurement of the body's descent into hypothermic death, they would unlock the secrets that would save Luftwaffe pilots and German soldiers freezing on the Russian front. Himmler placed his hand on Rascher's shoulder and spoke words that would echo through history's darkest chambers. These experiments can only be conducted on human beings, not on animals, because animals have different protective mechanisms. The prisoners must serve the Reich in some form. If their lives have no value as workers, they will have value as objects of scientific research that will save German pilots. What neither Rascher nor Himmler could foresee, or perhaps deliberately chose to ignore, was that the experiments they were about to conduct would produce nothing but scientifically worthless data purchased with unspeakable human suffering. Torture disguised as medical research, sadism dressed in the language of science, murder documented in clinical terminology. Over the next 9 months, between August 1942 and May 1943, approximately 280 to 300 prisoners, Polish resistance fighters, Russian POWs, Jews, and Roma, would be subjected to 360 to 400 individual hypothermia experiments. Some would endure the torture multiple times. Between 80 and 100 would die screaming in tanks of ice water or strapped naked to tables in subzero cold. All of it would be meticulously recorded in tables marked exitus, the Latin word for death. And all of it would be ultimately useless, the data too corrupted by the terror and malnutrition of the subjects to provide any meaningful insight into treating hypothermia in healthy pilots. The mathematics of medical atrocity were being written in the frigid water of Dachau's experimental tanks, and the numbers told a story of systematic torture masquerading as science. Between 360 and 400 experiments. Between 280 and 300 victims. The disparity between these numbers revealed the horrifying truth. Many prisoners were subjected to the experiments repeatedly, their bodies used again and again until they could no longer provide data, until they died or were executed for autopsy. This was not research. This was industrialized sadism operating under institutional approval from the highest levels of the SS, the Luftwaffe, and the Nazi medical establishment. The temperature gradients told their own story. Normal human core temperature, 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia begins at 35 degrees Celsius. At 32 degrees, violent shivering ceases, and severe mental confusion begins. At 28 degrees, the victim loses consciousness, and the heart enters fibrillation. At 25 to 27 degrees, death becomes virtually inevitable. Rascher documented this descent with obsessive precision. Rectal thermometers inserted 27 centimeters into the colon. Cardiac electrodes monitoring heart rate every 15 minutes. Temperature readings charting the body's inexorable slide toward death. In ice water immersion at 0 to 4 degrees Celsius, body temperature fell approximately 1 degree every 10 to 15 minutes. Most victims reached severe hypothermia, below 28 degrees, within 60 to 90 minutes. Some lasted 3 to 5 hours before death. The cold exposure protocol was equally brutal. Victims stripped naked and strapped to stretchers, left outside during Bavarian winter nights where temperatures plunged to -6 to -20 degrees Celsius, -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Duration, up to 14 hours. The screaming could be heard across the camp, then the silence when unconsciousness finally arrived, then death. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Of the 280 to 300 victims, between 80 and 100 died during the experiments or were immediately executed afterward so that Rascher could perform autopsies. Witnesses later testified that he dissected brains while victims were still alive, studying the formation of air bubbles in blood vessels. Survivors carried permanent damage, chronic heart problems, impaired circulation, brain damage from oxygen deprivation. But the most damning statistic was this: the data was worthless. After the war, when legitimate medical researchers examined Rascher's meticulously kept records, they concluded the experiments had no scientific value whatsoever. The victims were malnourished, diseased, psychologically terrorized prisoners, not healthy Luftwaffe pilots. Their physiological responses to hypothermia were distorted beyond any meaningful application. Rascher had known this. The Luftwaffe commanders had known this. Himmler had known this. But scientific validity was never the point. The point was demonstrating ideological loyalty through the spectacle of scientized cruelty. The point was advancing careers in the SS through documented brutality. The point was reducing human beings to experimental objects, stripping them of dignity, agency, and finally life itself, all while maintaining the pretense of medical progress. The hypothermia experiments at Dachau were not the work of a rogue psychopath operating in isolation. They were a fully authorized program with institutional support extending from Heinrich Himmler's office to the Luftwaffe's command structure to the Nazi medical establishment. The paper trail was extensive and damning. In June 1942, Sigmund Rascher wrote directly to Himmler proposing the experiments. His letter articulated the problem with bureaucratic clarity. Hundreds of Luftwaffe pilots were dying of hypothermia after ejecting over the North Sea and the Baltic during the Battle of Britain and subsequent air campaigns over the English Channel. Current medical protocols based on animal experiments and theoretical models were inadequate. What was needed, Rascher argued, was direct human experimentation under conditions that precisely replicated the circumstances faced by downed pilots. These experiments can only be conducted on human beings, not on animals, Rascher wrote, because animals have different protective mechanisms. He proposed using concentration camp prisoners who, he claimed, were otherwise of no value to the war effort. Their deaths in the service of science would be their contribution to the Reich. Himmler's response was enthusiastic. On May 20, 1942, in a meeting at Himmler's office attended by Field Marshal Erhard Milch, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, the experiments were officially authorized. Himmler ordered that Rascher be given complete access to prisoners at Dachau, and that all necessary equipment be provided. The Luftwaffe supplied a portable pressure chamber, pilot uniforms for victims to wear during immersion, and medical officers to observe the experiments and provide technical guidance. This was not merely administrative approval. Himmler personally attended some of the experiments at Dachau, standing in the cold air of Barrack 5, watching as prisoners screamed and convulsed in tanks of ice water. His presence was a form of ideological validation, a signal that the suffering being inflicted was not merely permitted, but celebrated as service to the fatherland. The Luftwaffe's involvement went beyond providing equipment. Senior medical officers from the German Experimental Institute for Aviation in Munich regularly visited Dachau to review Rascher's protocols and examine his data. Initially, Rascher worked alongside Dr. Holzlohner from the University of Kiel and Dr. Finke, another aviation medicine specialist. From August through October 1942, the three conducted experiments together. Then, when Holzlohner and Finke expressed reservations about the brutality of the methods, Rascher took sole control. From October 1942 through May 1943, he directed the operation alone, answerable only to Himmler. This institutional framework, approval from the SS, material support from the Luftwaffe, participation by university physicians, demonstrated that the atrocity was not an aberration but a policy. It revealed the complete corruption of medical ethics when subordinated to totalitarian ideology. The Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm, had been inverted. Nazi physicians deliberately inflicted maximum harm and called it science. To understand what the statistics meant in human terms, one must hear the voice of those who survived. Father Leo Michalowski, a Polish Catholic priest, was arrested in 1940 and sent to Dachau. On a day in late 1942, he was selected for Rascher's hypothermia experiments. Years later, at the Nuremberg Medical Trial in 1947, Michalowski took the stand in the Palace of Justice and described what happened to him. His testimony, preserved in the trial transcripts, remains one of the most harrowing first-hand accounts of medical torture in the historical record. I was brought to Barrack 5. Michalowski testified, his voice steady, but his hands trembling slightly. Dr. Rascher was there with his assistants. They ordered me to remove my clothes. I was naked. They inserted a rectal thermometer, very deep, 27 centimeters. It caused great pain. Then they inserted electrodes for measuring my heart. Then they threw me into the water tank. The water was ice cold, between 0 and 4 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. Michalowski's initial core temperature was 37.6 degrees Celsius, slightly above normal due to the stress and fear. When I was thrown into the water, he continued, my whole body went into shock. The cold was like knives cutting into every part of me. I began to scream, but Dr. Rascher told me to be silent. I tried to control myself, but the pain was unbearable. After a few minutes, I began to shiver violently. My teeth chattered so hard I thought they would break. Then the shivering became more violent. My arms and legs were shaking uncontrollably. Rascher and his assistants observed with clinical detachment, taking notes, calling out temperature readings. After 15 minutes, they took blood from my ear. Michalowski said, they did this every 15 minutes throughout the experiment. The temperature dropped. First 35 degrees, then 33, then 30. My hands became stiff like iron, my feet the same. I could not move them. The shivering was so violent that water splashed out of the tank. As the temperature continued to fall, Michalowski's consciousness began to fragment. I started to feel very strange, he testified. I was confused. I could not think clearly. I forgot where I was. Cold sweat appeared on my forehead even though I was in ice water. I felt like I was dying. The pain in my chest was terrible. My heart was beating very fast and then very slow. I could not breathe properly. I was gasping for air. At approximately 28 degrees Celsius, Michalowski lost consciousness. I do not remember anything after that point, he said. They told me later that they left me in the water for another hour after I passed out. They were measuring how long it would take for me to die. But I did not die. They pulled me out and tried to revive me. The rewarming process was almost as brutal as the freezing. Rascher used the hot water method, immediately plunging Michalowski's semi-frozen body into a bath heated to 40 to 45 degrees Celsius. The thermal shock was catastrophic. I woke up screaming, Michalowski recalled. The hot water felt like boiling oil on my frozen skin. My heart felt like it would burst. I was convulsing. They held me down in the water. I begged them to stop. Dr. Rascher just watched and took notes. Michalowski survived, but he was permanently damaged. Even now, he told the court in 1947, 5 years after the experiment, I have heart problems. I cannot walk quickly. I sweat excessively even in cold weather. I have circulation problems in my hands and feet. These are the effects that I carry every day. But more than the physical damage, I carry the memory of that tank, the memory of those doctors watching me freeze, writing down measurements while I begged for mercy. I learned that true evil is not always shouted in hatred. Sometimes it is whispered in clinical language, recorded in tables, justified as scientific necessity. And that form of evil may be the most dangerous of all. His testimony lasted less than an hour, but it transformed the statistics into flesh, the data into suffering. Father Michalowski had given the 280 to 300 victims a voice. The experimental protocols Rascher designed revealed the systematic nature of the atrocity. There were two primary methods: cold water immersion and dry cold exposure. Each was meticulously planned to maximize data collection while ensuring prolonged suffering. The cold water immersion protocol worked as follows. Victims were brought to Barrack 5 where the experimental tanks had been installed. These were large metal tubs approximately 2 meters long and 1 meter wide, filled with water maintained at 0 to 4 degrees Celsius through the continuous addition of ice. Some victims were dressed in Luftwaffe pilot uniforms, complete with flight suits and boots, to simulate the conditions of a pilot who had ejected into the ocean. Others were stripped completely naked to measure the baseline effect of cold water on unprotected human tissue. Before immersion, Rascher inserted a rectal thermometer 27 centimeters into the victim's colon to continuously monitor core body temperature. Cardiac electrodes were attached to measure heart rate and rhythm. Some victims also had blood pressure cuffs attached and electroencephalogram electrodes placed on their scalps to monitor brain activity. The victim was then forced or thrown into the ice water. In some experiments, the victim was completely submerged except for the face. In others, the water level was maintained at the neck to prevent accidental drowning before sufficient data could be collected. Rascher wanted to measure the complete progression of hypothermia to death, and premature drowning would compromise the data. The measurements began immediately. Every 15 minutes, Rascher or an assistant drew blood from the victim's ear to measure changes in blood chemistry. Temperature and heart rate were recorded continuously. Rascher noted when violent shivering began, typically within the first few minutes. He noted when the shivering ceased, usually around 32 degrees Celsius core temperature, a sign that the body's thermoregulatory system was failing. He noted when the victim lost consciousness, typically between 28 and 30 degrees Celsius. He noted the onset of cardiac arrhythmia, the irregular heartbeat that preceded cardiac arrest, and he noted the time of death, usually when core temperature reached 25 to 27 degrees Celsius. Duration varied. Some victims died within 60 minutes. Others lasted 3 hours. A few, particularly those dressed in flight suits that provided minimal insulation, lasted up to 5 hours in agony. Rascher's tables, preserved in Nazi archives and later presented at Nuremberg, documented each experiment with cold precision. Subject 37, male, age 32, Polish political prisoner, initial temp 37.2 C, immersed 1430 hours, complete submersion in 2 C water, flight suit, violent shivering begins immediately, 15 min, temp 35.1 C, 30 min, temp 32.8 C. Shivering ceases. Subject semi-conscious. 45 min temp 30.2 C. Subject unconscious. Heart rate irregular. 60 min temp 28.1 C. Cardiac arrest. Resuscitation attempted. Failed. Exodus at 15:37 hours. Duration 67 minutes. Cause of death hypothermic cardiac failure. The dry-cold exposure protocol was conducted outdoors during Bavarian winter nights, when temperatures dropped to -6 to -20 degrees Celsius. Victims were stripped completely naked and strapped to wooden stretchers or tables. Some were positioned upright, others laid flat. The stretchers were left outside, usually in an open area of the camp where wind could increase convective heat loss. The monitoring equipment was the same: rectal thermometers, cardiac electrodes, periodic blood draws. But the progression to death was slower and arguably more agonizing. In water, heat loss is rapid due to water's high thermal conductivity. In air, especially still air, heat loss is slower. Victims in the dry-cold protocol typically lasted 8 to 14 hours before death. Throughout this time, they remained conscious longer, aware of their suffering. Frostbite developed on exposed skin. Fingers and toes turned black. The skin became rigid and brittle. Some victims were observed crying, the tears freezing on their cheeks. Others screamed until their vocal cords failed. Many begged for death. Rascher documented it all with the same clinical detachment. Subject 53, male. Age 28, Russian POW. Initial temp 37.0 C. Exposed at 22 arc hours. Ambient temp -12 C. Wind 15 kph. Subject naked, supine position. Violent shivering begins within minutes. Subject crying and pleading in Russian. 1 hour, temp 35.4 C. Shivering continues, subject quieter. 3 hours, temp 31.2 C. Shivering ceased. Subject semi-conscious, visible frostbite on extremities. 6 hours, temp 28.7 C, subject unconscious, heart rate 38 BPM, 10 hours, temp 26.1 C, cardiac arrest, exodus at aero 8.15 hours. Duration, 10 hours 15 minutes. Those who survived the initial freezing faced a second phase of torture, the rewarming experiments. Rascher was not merely interested in how long it took to freeze a human being to death. He wanted to test various methods of reviving victims from near-fatal hypothermia. The Luftwaffe needed practical field methods for warming downed pilots rescued from the North Sea. But Rascher's rewarming protocols were as brutal and scientifically invalid as the freezing experiments. He tested 4 primary methods. The first was rapid immersion in hot water. Victims whose core temperature had dropped to 28 to 30 degrees Celsius, who were unconscious or semi-conscious, were immediately pulled from the ice water and plunged into baths heated to 40 to 45 degrees Celsius. The thermal shock was catastrophic. The sudden expansion of peripheral blood vessels caused a precipitous drop in blood pressure. Cold blood from the extremities rushed to the heart, further cooling the core in what medical literature calls afterdrop. Many victims died immediately of cardiac arrest. Others convulsed violently, their hearts unable to cope with the rapid temperature change. Rascher noted these deaths with clinical interest, but continued the protocol. Subject 41, male, age 35, Jewish prisoner, core temp, 28. See after 90 minutes cold water immersion. Subject unconscious. Transferred immediately to hot water bath 43C. Rewarming initiated at 16:05. Subject regained consciousness briefly, screaming, violent convulsions, cardiac arrest at 16:08, 3 minutes after rewarming began. Exodus. Conclusion. Rapid rewarming from severe hypothermia causes fatal cardiac shock. The second method was gradual rewarming using heated sleeping bags and blankets. This was more effective but less interesting to Rascher, because it produced fewer acute crises to observe and document. Victims were wrapped in wool blankets and placed in sleeping bags with hot water bottles. The process took hours. Many survived, though with lasting damage. The third method was radiant heat from lamps. High-intensity lamps were focused on the victim's torso to warm the core before the extremities. This method, like the sleeping bags, was moderately effective but again lacked the dramatic immediacy that Rascher seemed to crave. The fourth method was the most sadistic and revealed the depths of depravity to which the experiments had descended. It was called animal warmth and was based on a suggestion from Himmler himself. Himmler had read or been told folklore about Nordic fishermen who, after falling into icy water, were warmed by their wives using body heat and sexual intercourse. He wrote to Rascher suggesting this method be tested scientifically. Rascher enthusiastically complied. He requisitioned 4 female prisoners from Ravensbrück concentration camp. The women, all Romani, were brought to Dachau specifically for these experiments. When a male victim's core temperature reached 28 to 30 degrees Celsius, he was removed from the ice water and placed naked on a bed. 2 women, also naked, were forced to lie on either side of him, pressing their bodies against his to transfer heat. In some experiments, the women were ordered to engage in sexual intercourse with the semi-conscious, hypothermic victim. The rationale was that sexual arousal might increase blood flow and accelerate rewarming. Rascher observed these sessions, taking notes, measuring temperatures, timing the process. He photographed some of them, images later discovered in Nazi archives and presented as evidence at Nuremberg. The method was almost completely ineffective. Most victims were so deeply hypothermic that they never regained consciousness. Their core temperatures rose slowly, if at all. Many died despite the forced intimacy. The few who survived showed no significant difference in recovery time compared to those warmed by blankets. In his report to Himmler, Rascher admitted that animal warmth was no more effective than passive rewarming, but he framed this conclusion in language that suggested further experimentation might yield better results. He never explicitly acknowledged what the experiments truly were: sexual assault weaponized as scientific procedure, rape justified as medical research. The 4 women from Ravensbrück, whose names are not recorded in Rascher's meticulous notes, disappeared after the experiments concluded. They were likely executed to prevent them from testifying about what they had been forced to do. In the years after World War II, as the magnitude of Nazi medical atrocities became known, an uncomfortable question arose in the scientific community. Should data obtained through torture ever be used? The hypothermia experiments at Dachau became the focal point of this debate. Rascher had produced extensive documentation, thousands of pages of notes, tables, graphs, and photographs. He had measured with precision the physiological changes that occurred as human beings froze to death. He had tested multiple rewarming methods under controlled conditions. Could this data, however horrifically obtained, contribute to medical knowledge? Could it save lives in the future, perhaps justifying in some small way the suffering that produced it? In 1988, Dr. Robert Pozos, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota Duluth, attempted to use data from the Dachau hypothermia experiments in a review article about cold water survival. His decision sparked immediate controversy. The New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, published a scathing editorial condemning any use of Nazi data. Survivors of the experiments, including those who had testified at Nuremberg, expressed outrage that their suffering might be reframed as a scientific contribution. The debate forced a thorough re-examination of Rascher's data by medical experts, and the conclusion was unequivocal. The data was scientifically worthless. It was, in the words of Dr. Leo Alexander, the American medical consultant to the prosecution at Nuremberg, of no scientific value whatsoever. The reasons were multiple and damning. First, the experimental subjects were not representative of the population Rascher claimed to be studying, healthy Luftwaffe pilots. The prisoners at Dachau were severely malnourished, many suffering from tuberculosis, typhus, and other diseases endemic to concentration camps. Their baseline physiology was already compromised. Their thermoregulatory systems, immune responses, and cardiovascular function were not those of well-fed, healthy aviators. Any data derived from them could not be generalized to the target population. Second, the extreme psychological terror experienced by the victims fundamentally altered their physiological responses. Fear triggers a cascade of stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, that affect heart rate, blood pressure, metabolism, and thermal regulation. Rascher's subjects were not merely cold. They were terrified, aware that they were being tortured, that they might die, that their suffering was intentional. This psychological state introduced uncontrolled variables that corrupted every measurement. A pilot ejecting into the North Sea, while certainly afraid, would not experience the same existential terror as a concentration camp prisoner being subjected to deliberate torture by his captors. The physiological responses were therefore not comparable. Third, Rascher's methodology was fundamentally flawed. He frequently manipulated data to produce results that would please his superiors. His notes contained inconsistencies, impossible values, and obvious fabrications. Some experiments were described in his reports but had no corresponding documentation in his raw data logs, suggesting they never occurred or were heavily altered. Some temperature readings were physiologically implausible, such as claims that victims survived core temperatures below 25 degrees Celsius for extended periods, which contradicts all subsequent research on hypothermia. Rascher was not conducting rigorous science. He was producing ideologically satisfying narratives dressed in scientific language. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Rascher's experiments were designed not to answer specific, falsifiable hypotheses, but to demonstrate loyalty and advance his career. The questions he claimed to be investigating, what is the survival time in cold water, and which rewarming method is most effective, had already been extensively studied using ethical methods. Animal experiments, case studies of accidental hypothermia, and controlled experiments with consenting volunteers had produced substantial literature on hypothermia and rewarming. Rascher's experiments added nothing new except documentation of human suffering. In the end, the scientific community reached consensus. The Dachau hypothermia data should never be cited or used. Not because it was obtained unethically, though that alone would be sufficient reason, but because it was methodologically corrupt, scientifically invalid, and contributed nothing to medical knowledge. The 280 to 300 victims suffered and died for data that had no value whatsoever. Sigmund Rascher never faced justice at Nuremberg. Ironically, he was destroyed not by his crimes against humanity, but by a domestic scandal that enraged his patron, Heinrich Himmler. In 1943, Rascher married Carolina Nini Diehl, a woman 15 years his senior. Nini claimed to have given birth to 3 children during the marriage, an astonishing feat given that she was 48 years old at the time of the first birth. Himmler, obsessed with increasing the Aryan birth rate, celebrated Nini as an example of German female fertility and used her as propaganda. He showered the Rascher family with gifts and honors. In 1944, the truth emerged. Nini had not given birth to any children. She had kidnapped 3 infants from maternity wards and orphanages, pretending they were her own. When one of the mothers identified her stolen child, the fraud collapsed. Himmler was humiliated. His paragon of Aryan motherhood was a child thief, and his protégé, the brilliant Dr. Rascher, was either complicit or a fool. Either way, the embarrassment was unforgivable. In April 1944, both Sigmund and Nini Rascher were arrested by the SS and imprisoned. The charges were not murder, not torture, not crimes against humanity, but fraud and dishonoring the SS. Nini was sent to Ravensbrück, the same camp from which Rascher had requisitioned women for his animal warmth experiments. Sigmund was sent to Dachau, the same camp where he had tortured hundreds of prisoners. There is a grim poetry in this. The architect of the hypothermia experiments, the man who had ordered prisoners thrown into tanks of ice water and strapped naked to tables in subzero cold, was now himself a prisoner in Barrack 73 of Dachau. Whether he was subjected to any of the experimental protocols he had designed is not recorded, though some survivor testimony suggests he was treated with particular cruelty by prisoner functionaries who knew his reputation. On April 26, 1945, as American forces approached Dachau, the SS began executing prisoners who could testify about camp atrocities. Sigmund Rascher was among them. He was shot in the back of the head and his body thrown into a mass grave. He died 3 days before the camp was liberated by the 42nd Infantry Division of the United States 7th Army. Nini Rascher was executed at Ravensbrück on April 27, 1945, 1 day after her husband. Because Rascher died before the war ended, he was never indicted at Nuremberg. His crimes, however, became central to the prosecution's case against other Nazi doctors. His reports, his photographs, his meticulously kept tables of death, all of it was presented as evidence in the doctor's trial that began in December 1946. The legacy of his atrocities would shape medical ethics for generations. Nuremberg, Germany, December 20, 1946. Courtroom 600 of the Palace of Justice was silent except for the soft whir of the film projector. On the screen, images appeared that would haunt everyone in the room for the rest of their lives. A man, naked, submerged to the neck in a metal tank of water, his face contorted in agony, ice crystals visible on the surface of the water. Another man, strapped to a table, his skin mottled purple and white from frostbite, his eyes open but unseeing. A table covered with documents, Rascher's meticulous notes, each page documenting the descent of human beings into hypothermic death measured in 15-minute intervals. Dr. Leo Alexander, the American medical consultant to the prosecution, stood beside the screen, his face grave. The 23 defendants, Nazi doctors and medical administrators, sat in the dock. Some watched the screen, others looked away. A few took notes, as if this were an ordinary medical conference. Alexander began to speak, his voice measured but carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "What you are seeing," he said, "is not medical research. It is systematic torture conducted by physicians who swore an oath to heal. Between August 1942 and May 1943, Dr. Sigmund Rascher and his assistants conducted approximately 360 to 400 experiments on approximately 280 to 300 prisoners at Dachau concentration camp. These men were not volunteers. They were not informed of the nature of the experiments. They were not given the opportunity to refuse. They were slaves, and they were tortured to death in the name of science. The projector clicked to the next image, a graph showing the decline of core body temperature over time, each line representing a human life reduced to data. Alexander continued. Between 80 and 100 of these prisoners died during the experiments or were executed immediately afterward for autopsy. Many more suffered permanent damage. The defense will argue that these experiments were necessary, that the exigencies of war justified them, that the knowledge gained could save German lives. But the truth is simpler and more terrible. These experiments produced no valuable knowledge. The data is scientifically worthless because the subjects were malnourished, diseased, and psychologically terrorized. Their responses to hypothermia cannot be generalized to healthy pilots. Every medical expert who has reviewed this data has reached the same conclusion. It has no scientific value whatsoever. He paused, letting the words settle. Then he looked directly at the defendants. Dr. Rascher froze 280 to 300 human beings, killed at least 80 of them, ruined the lives of the survivors, and produced nothing. Nothing except documentation of his own sadism. The tragedy is not merely that these people died in agony. The tragedy is that they died for nothing. Their suffering purchased no knowledge, saved no lives, contributed nothing to medicine. They were murdered to advance the career of a psychopath and to demonstrate loyalty to a genocidal regime. The courtroom remained silent. General Telford Taylor, the chief prosecutor, rose to deliver his closing argument on the hypothermia experiments. His voice was controlled fury. The defense has argued that these experiments were conducted under military necessity, that the urgency of war justified methods that would not be acceptable in peacetime. But this argument collapses under examination. There was no urgency. The problem of hypothermia in downed pilots had been studied for decades using ethical methods, animal experiments, case studies, controlled trials with volunteers. The medical literature on hypothermia was extensive. Rascher's experiments added nothing to this knowledge. They were not necessary. They were not even useful. They were murder, dressed in the language of science to make it palatable to perpetrators who wanted to see themselves as researchers rather than torturers. Taylor held up a document, one of Rascher's reports, and read aloud. Subject 47, male, age 31, Polish political prisoner, immersed in 2 degrees Celsius water, duration 73 minutes. Exodus. He lowered the document and looked at the court. Exodus. The Latin word for death chosen to maintain clinical distance from the act of killing. This document does not say, "We held a 31-year-old man in ice water for 73 minutes until he died screaming." It says exitus, as if death were a natural endpoint of an experiment rather than murder. This is how medicine becomes monstrous, not through sudden transformation but through gradual dehumanization. First, the victims are redesignated as experimental subjects or material. Then, suffering is recontextualized as data. Finally, murder is rationalized as necessary sacrifice for the greater good. This is the path these defendants followed, and this is the path that must never be traveled again. In the dock, the defendants remained impassive, but in the public gallery, survivors of Dachau wept. Father Leo Michalowski sat among them, his hands clasped tightly, remembering the ice water, the electrodes, the thermometer inserted deep into his body, the screaming, his own screaming that no one had acknowledged as evidence of suffering. For the first time since his torture 3 years earlier, someone with authority was calling it what it was: a crime, not an experiment, a crime. On August 19, 1947, after 139 days of testimony and deliberation, the judges of the Nuremberg Medical Trial returned their verdicts. Of the 23 defendants, 7 were sentenced to death by hanging. 5 received life imprisonment. 4 received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. 7 were acquitted. The sentences were controversial, some arguing they were too lenient, others that they represented victors' justice. But the verdicts themselves were less important than what the trial had revealed about the corruption of medical ethics under totalitarianism and what it had created in response, the Nuremberg Code. On the same day the verdicts were announced, the tribunal published a 10-point ethical framework for medical experimentation on human subjects. The code began with an unambiguous declaration. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This was not a suggestion. It was not a guideline to be balanced against other considerations. It was an absolute principle. No experiment could be conducted on a human being without that person's informed, voluntary, uncoerced consent. The person must understand the nature, duration, purpose, methods, risks, and potential benefits of the experiment. The person must be competent to give consent, and the person must be free to withdraw consent at any time without penalty. The Code's remaining 9 principles addressed other aspects of ethical research. Experiments must be designed to yield socially important knowledge. Animal experimentation and other preliminary research must precede human trials. Risks must be minimized and proportionate to expected benefits. Experiments must be conducted by scientifically qualified personnel. Subjects must be free to terminate their participation. Researchers must terminate experiments if continuation appears likely to cause injury or death. Each principle was a direct response to specific atrocities documented at the trial. The Nuremberg Code transformed medical ethics worldwide. It became the foundation for the Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, which further elaborated ethical principles for medical research. It influenced the Belmont Report of 1979, which established ethical principles for research involving human subjects in the United States and led to the creation of institutional review boards at universities and hospitals. Every informed consent form signed by a patient or research volunteer today, every IRB review of a research protocol, every ethics committee deliberation traces its lineage to courtroom 600 in Nuremberg and to the 280 to 300 prisoners who died in Dachau's ice water tanks. The statistics of the Dachau hypothermia experiments are preserved in archives. 360 to 400 experiments, 280 to 300 victims, 80 to 100 deaths, temperatures ranging from normal 37 degrees Celsius to death at 25 to 27 degrees Celsius, durations from 60 minutes to 14 hours. But numbers alone cannot convey the magnitude of what occurred. Father Leo Michalowski, who survived to testify at Nuremberg, carried physical scars until his death in 1982. Chronic heart problems, impaired circulation, excessive sweating even in cold weather. But he carried psychological scars as well. In an interview decades after the trial, he reflected, "I learned at Dachau that evil is not always announced with hatred and violence. Sometimes it arrives in clinical language, justified as scientific necessity, performed by men who see themselves as researchers rather than murderers. This form of evil, evil that wears the mask of reason, may be the most dangerous because it corrupts not merely individuals, but entire institutions and professions." In 2012, the German Medical Association issued a formal apology for the role of German physicians in the Holocaust. The statement acknowledged that the medical profession had failed catastrophically to maintain ethical standards, that doctors had become instruments of genocide, and that the consequences of this failure would echo through generations. Today, the Dachau concentration camp memorial includes a section devoted to the medical experiments. Visitors walk through Barrack 5, now empty except for plaques describing what occurred there. They see photographs of the ice water tanks, now long removed. They read testimony from survivors, and they confront a question that every generation must answer. How do we prevent medicine, the profession dedicated to healing, from being transformed into an instrument of torture? The answer lies not in trusting that doctors are inherently good, that scientists are inherently ethical, or that institutions are inherently benevolent. The answer lies in establishing and enforcing absolute principles. Consent is essential, human dignity is inviolable, suffering cannot be justified by appeal to greater good or scientific necessity. These principles, forged in the frozen water of Dachau and codified in the Nuremberg Code, are not merely historical artifacts. They are living bulwarks against barbarism. And they must be defended in every generation, in every laboratory, in every hospital, in every place where the vulnerable encounter power dressed as expertise. The hypothermia experiments at Dachau demonstrated how quickly the ethical foundations of medicine can collapse when subordinated to ideology. Between August 1942 and May 1943, in a camp in Bavaria, physicians became torturers, suffering became data, and murder became research. 80 to 100 people died in agony. Hundreds more were permanently maimed, and the world learned that the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, is not self-enforcing. It requires constant vigilance, institutional safeguards, and individuals willing to refuse participation in atrocity, regardless of career cost or institutional pressure. This is the verdict of history, written in the testimony of survivors, preserved in the archives of Nuremberg, and embedded in the ethical codes that govern medicine today. There is no scientific necessity that justifies torture, no greater good that permits the reduction of human beings to experimental material, no ideology that can transform murder into progress. Sigmund Rascher tortured 280 to 300 people and produced nothing of value. His true legacy is not his data, which was worthless, but the ethical framework created in response to his crimes, a framework that has saved countless lives by ensuring that medicine remains bound to the principle of human dignity. That principle was purchased with the suffering of prisoners at Dachau. We honor them not by using the data from their torture, but by ensuring that such torture can never again be justified, rationalized, or conducted in the name of science.